I wasn't supposed to see it. The security cameras weren't meant for me, yet they recorded his final minutes, and I watched them until morning bled into the slow, gray light of regret. I ran the night desk at the Pine Ridge Motor Lodge for 3 years. It sat off a forgotten stretch of highway where the map made a hard right and the neon sign squinted at passing taillights. In summer, it smelled like sun-baked tar and cigarette smoke. By October, the ground was a sponge of rain and leaves and the kind of cold that gets into the back of your neck. At night, the place becomes a small country all its own. An old fluorescent tube over the reception that hummed like a distant wasp nest, a vending machine that never took coins without chewing them, and a narrow corridor that led to 12 rooms that sometimes hosted truckers, sometimes lovers, sometimes drifters who never stayed more than an afternoon. I kept an old thermos of coffee behind the counter and a stack of unpaid bills. I kept the CCTV monitor as a habit, not because anyone expected me to watch it. The feeds looped through 4 cameras: the parking lot, the reception, the short hallway to the rooms, and the corridor that split the motel in half. The cameras were grainy, fed by cheap infrared, the kind that throws everything into slightly wrong grayscale at night. They saw what they could and left the rest in shadow. The first time I remember noticing him, he was standing under the sodium light of the lot, a dark shape with a big wet coat, as if he had walked through a storm and taken the rain with him. He smelled like mud and something sweeter that made my stomach tighten, like cut grass left too long to rot. He paid in cash, asked for a room for the night, and didn't talk much. He asked me for a late checkout and told me his name in a way that didn't stick. He was ordinary in the concrete ways that matter: a suitcase with a broken handle, a pack of smokes with half the foil torn off, a small paper cup from a gas station. He left a puddle on the carpet outside room 7. I make a point of remembering small things. It's how you stay human when nights stretch and your face sets in the shape of the counter edge. The man, I'll call him the guest because that's what he was, had nails specked with dirt, hands that trembled when he folded the bill. He asked me for an extra blanket because the heater in his room sounded like metal teeth. He didn't ask about anything else. I handed over a key, said the usual "no parties, checkout is noon," and the night swallowed him. 2 nights later, Anita, who cleaned the rooms, knocked on my office door around 3 in the morning. She had a towel wrapped around one hand, and her eyes had that look housekeepers get when they have seen something they cannot put back into ordinary words. "You know room 7?" she said. Her voice was low, as if the walls had ears. "Yeah?" "There's this thing there," she said, "on the bed." I didn't imagine how bad anything could be. Houses, rooms, people's lives. Everybody leaves something behind. But I went to room 7, the fluorescent hallway light stuttering like a heartbeat, and I saw a small rag doll lying on the pillow where the guest had slept. It was nothing fancy, a child's cloth toy about the size of my palm, patched in 2 different fabrics, one faded floral, one a dull gray. Its face was simply 2 stitched eyes and a stitched mouth, both a shade darker than you'd expect from a child's toy. It smelled the way the guest smelled when he checked in, wet earth and something older that the rain brought out. Anita said she hadn't put it there. I said I'd get it removed. I took it to the trash behind the vending machines and left it in a black bag. Later, when I passed the dumpster on my way back to the office, the bag had been gnawed open and the doll gone. I told myself a raccoon had dragged it back out to play. I told myself an awful lot of things to sleep. The cameras caught a small part of that first night with the doll. The top left corner of camera 3, the corridor cam, had a pixel that kept whining, an iridescent dot on the feed that looked for all the world like a cigarette ember. The feed showed the guest opening his door, stepping into the hall with the carry-on, dropping the bag near the bed. For a full minute he stood under the bedroom lamp, looking at the suitcase like it had asked him a question. He sat, pulled the blanket up, and the image held him there, breathing. Then the corridor frame flashed, static for less than a second, and when it came back, the doorway held that rag doll, as if someone had placed it carefully on the threshold. There is an art to how a camera tells you the truth. It will give you the obvious facts and hide everything that matters. "Probably slipped in from the lot," Lewis said when I told the owner the next morning. Lewis ran the motel like a man who had made peace with doing a job no one envied. He'd been there since the 80s, his hair gone thin and his language culinary. He spoke of rooms like recipes, safe oven settings. "People drop things off the truck. Someone leaves it. Toss it. Don't make a fuss." We tossed it. 2 days later, the doll was back. This time it sat on the nightstand, leaning at an angle no one could have achieved without hands that understood balance. Anita started coming by in the afternoons to light incense in the storage room and hummed nonsense to stop herself listening. The feed picked up other little wrongnesses. On the 12th at 01:47:32, camera 2, the reception cam, showed the front door open for no one. You could see the rain slanting into the cold rectangle of pavement, but the angle captured no figure crossing the threshold. On the 13th at 02:19, the corridor cam recorded a smear that traveled the length of the hallway like someone dragging a shadow. The smear had no sound. We rewound, slowed, watched the smear loop. It would hesitate by room 7's door, pause a beat, and then remain near the edge of the frame as if the camera's sight line were precisely where it wanted to be. Not the bed, not the hall, but the line between the two. There were nights when noise seemed to vanish from places it should be. The highway thrummed beyond the motel's fence, trucks coughed through the rain. But some minuscule pocket of sound around the building would empty, like a cup turned upside down. You could feel it as a pressure in your ears, as if a hand had pressed a wet thumb over your mouth. Once, near dawn, I heard the vending machine in the corner of the lobby jam and then become as mute as a stone. People in towns come with pre-made stories. We like tidy answers because the world is otherwise a jumble. Some of the regulars said the motel had had bad luck before. Lewis mentioned a woman who had once rented room 7 for a long spell, left with a suitcase full of papers, and never returned. Others said it was the road. Roads collect people who carry pieces of their lives that need to be hidden for a night. A trucker named Hank swore he'd seen a lady in black walking past the lot at 2:30 in the morning, all stovepipe and shawl, and when he flashed his beams, there was nothing but the rain. Hank loved using the motel for a story. He widened his eyes, and everyone at the counter loved him for it. The thing about nights is that they let you guess at your worst, and sometimes your imagination stitches the best disguise for the truth. For a while, I let myself believe in simple explanations. Drafts, hungry animals, the camera's quirks. I told myself the doll was a prank, that someone had an odd sense of humor. But patterns talk when you quiet the other voices. The doll always moved back to the bed after we thought it gone. The hallway humidified with a smell like wet clay the mornings after the doll reappeared, even if it hadn't rained. The CCTV's audio track would lurch to a thin whisper in the moments directly before the feed hiccuped. Those were the precise, small signals that make people stop being casual about the world. There is a version of bravery that means pretending nothing is wrong. I kept pretending to be brave until the night the guest came down the hallway at 2:13 a.m., and I thought, for a half second, I was looking at my own shadow. That night, the wind had been loud enough to make the overhead sign groan. I had been at the desk with a thermos on my palm and a song stuck in a cassette tape player I hadn't fixed in years. Lewis had gone to bed early. He didn't handle the cold like he used to. Anita had clocked out but left the storage light on to dry the towels. The sky pressed down with rain like a wet blanket. The guest had been quiet during breakfast. I had seen him at the breakfast cart just after 8 in the morning, his hair plastered to his skull, eating cereal with a kind of hunger people reserve for long trips. He looked middle-aged, and his coat had dried in patches, blotches of sun-washed sodium. He didn't lock the door to his room when he left. He didn't lock anything. He was the type of person who leaves the door open to invite the air. At 9:30 p.m. on the 22nd, the new staff from the next town over, young, eager Tomas, came in to train for a couple of nights, and the guest checked out and then checked back in 2 hours later in a different shirt, as if he had walked to the other side of town and decided the motel was all he'd need. Tomas was nervous. He asked me about the CCTV system, and I told him more than he wanted to know. "Watch the timestamp," I told him. "All the important things hide in the numbers." We watched together sometimes as a joke. It was easier to be afraid if you could joke. At 01:49:17 on the 23rd, the corridor cam caught the guest opening his door, holding the handle for a beat, as if he had forgotten what a handle is for. He stepped into the hall, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark. The camera tried to focus on him, but favored the way the sodium light pooled around his shoes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, something that bulged and gave off the same damp smell the doll had carried. He tucked the bundle under his arm and went back into his room. I couldn't say why my curiosity felt necessary that night. Perhaps curiosity is a superstition, an act of hoping the world will not turn away. Maybe it started as the way one looks after a stray animal, or the way a man counts his coins. I did what everyone does when they think a thing can be managed. I watched. The camera recorded the guest on his bed at 0:10:36. He lay on his back with his hands behind his head as if he had been practicing patience. The tape showed the bed rise with each breath, the shape of him making a small shelter in the blanket. On the nightstand, the lamp breathed a warm circle, and the doll sat at an angle like a question mark. At 02:11:58, the corridor feed flickered. The video paused, and for 1 second, the world of the motel was a still photograph, a stationary ghost. When the picture returned, the doorway of room 7 was empty. A smear that moved with a peculiar, wrong insistence, leaned into the frame from the left. It did not have a torso or feet. It was as if someone had poured a shape into the air. The smear moved toward the bed and stopped. The guest turned, slowly, like a man waking from a dream that has teeth. He sat up. He held himself there, hands working at nothing. The audio track on the feed is a thin animal. It picks up every mechanical hum and misses whole rooms of sound. On the recording, there's a hiss, and then, beneath it, a breath that doesn't match his. It's not loud. It shouldn't be a clue. But it's the kind of thing you remember in the body, the way the breath arrives a half second before the movement. The guest's eyes go downward and then to the camera, and in that tilt there's a recognition, as if he'd looked at a family member he never wanted to meet. When the feed cuts, it does not cut clean. It stutters. The image melts for 2 frames, like someone dragged a magnet over the picture. And then the corridor shows a seam of blackness to the left of the bed, a figure folded against the threshold, as if someone had sat on the floor and become the shadow. The guest gets off the bed. He walks out of his room in the footage and stands for a moment in the hallway. For the first time, when I watched in the security room with Tomas and Anita peering over my shoulder, I saw the guest look directly toward camera 3, as if he could see where the camera's eye sat, like he'd found the place in which his life was being watched. "Pause it," Tomas said. He always said pause it with a certain relief of not having to speak if the world collapsed. But you can't pause what you live through. I hit rewind instead. We watched the frames back and forth until the light in the corridor had braided itself into a loop. The guest's hand twitched as he reached toward the door. The camera picked him up as a shape overlaid with grain. On the screen, he lifted a small thing from his pocket, a key or a coin, it was hard to tell, and the corridor grew unusually still. In the thumbnail of the top left corner, something pulsed like a heart. What made me uneasy then wasn't the image itself, but the way the feed put me outside of the moment. Watching CCTV is like reading a letter that has already been written. You know the paper cut won't heal no matter how carefully you hold it. At 02:12:43, right before the most obvious break in the footage, he looked at the camera and smiled. It was a small, private thing, the kind of smile a man gives to a photograph he knows will be taken without his consent. But the camera was the photograph, and the smile was a message. The hair on my arms rose like the first inch of a storm's wind. We filed the night away as best we could. Luis said to write an incident report if we felt nervous. The town's hotline told us they wouldn't send anyone out unless there were bodies or fire. The police, when we called, told us to file a report and let us know they'd be when convenient. There is a practical cruelty to bureaucracy at 2 in the morning. It is the most reassuring thing because it is slow and therefore logically safe. We did what motel people do with things they can't explain. We boxed them up. We labeled them lost and found. We put the doll in a shoebox and slid the box into the back of the linen closet. At least we could contain something. There is a kind of safety in the act of putting a strange thing into a labeled space. It gives you the illusion of order. I couldn't stop thinking about the guest's smile. The next 2 days felt like walking through a room full of glass. I found myself watching the lobby door even when no one was coming. I found myself keeping the lights on. At 4 a.m., I made espresso and stirred sugar into it until it dissolved into a pale concoction that soured my hands. I told myself I was being sensible. I told myself that when the motel spit out the truth, it would be ugly and everything would slide back into its habit of making sense. At 10:23 p.m. on November 24th, Tomas called me from the lot. "There's a van pulled up," he said. "Guy's got a camera rig, claims he's a filmmaker, wants to shoot some night footage." I should have told him to refuse. I didn't. We are weak in the practical sense of being human. People ask favors and we hand them out because it keeps the ledger of our small lives balanced. The man with the camera said he was documenting highway motels for a class and could leave in an hour. He asked permission to taste the silence at the motel because he had aesthetic reasons. Louis humored him. Tomas let him mount a camera on the lamp pole across the lot, the sort of thing a man with a tripod does when he wants to look important. The van rolled away at 1 a.m., and life returned to its dim rhythm. On the morning after that, the man with the camera came to the desk, red-eyed and polite, and told us he had left empty footage when he had dropped a memory card. He asked if we'd found it. We did not find it. The card had stayed with its owner. It seemed like an easy thing to forget in the business of nights. Later that day, there's a video uploaded to a small private account. 3 hours of empty motel in gray grain, and on it, at one point, a smear that leans into the lot almost politely, as if waiting its turn. I have watched the internet make monsters of small things. A thread grows as people add detail. A rumor bulks into a myth with each retelling. We did not want to feed any of that. Still, the motel had become a place people passed by in a different way. Truckers slowed, the route's regulars told stories with the delighted terror of those who had once sat at the edge of a cliff. But the thing that anchored my unease wasn't the town talk. It was the object that kept returning, and the way the camera recorded the corridor moments as if the hall itself had memory. The camera is a cold witness. It cannot forgive. It only frames and stores. Watching the tapes made me feel both less and more. Less safe, more aware. There is a hunger that watching creates. You start to find yourself waiting for the next feed to betray what you already know. 1 week after the doll first appeared, at 2 a.m., Anita called me. She was trembling and quick, The way you are when you carry an image too bright not to warn someone. You need to come, she said, now. The corridor was familiar, in the way a room is familiar when you have slept in it every night. The lamp over room 7 buzzed a bit, and the air smelled of old rain. The door to room 7 was cracked open. On the bed sat the guest. He hadn't been in room 7 since the 23rd, or at least that's what the log said. He sat perfectly still, the way people do when they decide to stop participating in the world. His coat lay folded at his feet. On the pillow beside him, the doll sat stitched and expectant. The television in the room was an absence of light. Anita said that when she had knocked, the guest had looked through the door and folded back in like he'd been punched. She said his eyes were hollow and wet, and he'd said, "You shouldn't watch me from the edge." I don't like saying someone's name with no one there to answer. That's the odd cruelty of being the kind of person who watches cameras. You keep other people's stories intact until they are no longer there to claim them. I touched the guest's shoulder and felt the body cool and thin as paper. I told Anita to get Louis. I told Tomas to call the police. I told myself not to look at the bed where the doll sat like a punctuation in a life I hadn't known the start of. The coroner took pictures. The police took a statement. They were kind in the professional way of people who have to be kind so that their own brains don't fracture. The official report said the guest had died of natural causes, that there was no sign of external trauma, no indication of foul play. They took the guest's wallet. The guest's name in the wallet had been different than the name he'd used at the desk. He had a small phonograph tucked between two receipts. It was of a field, bright and sun-split, and a hand had scrawled, "Come home," on the back. The coroner's men were thorough, polite, and distant. They moved through the motel with the kind of mechanical sorrow that lets professions do their work without ending. We watched the camera footage together in the back office because that is what one does when the world hands you a stack of images and says, "Interpret this." The feed at 02:13:07 is a loop I will never be able to unsee. It shows him on the bed, the doll on the pillow, his breathing a metronome. Then, for no reason we could agree upon, he sits up. He looks to the door. The corridor frames somebody who is not there. No feet, no form, just a smear. And the guest stands and goes to the door. He opens it. In the footage, he turns to the camera as if to wave at a friend and then walks out of frame. The corridor is empty. There is a long pause in the file where the image simply breathes, as if the camera is holding a note the way a violin does before the bow moves on. Then, at 02:13:43, the image tilts. The lamp at the end of the corridor flickers as if breathing shallow. That was the last clear thing. After that, the feed fragments, and the rest is what the brain does when it tries to hold on to something that's already dissolved. I kept copies of the tapes. I told myself a practical reason. Evidence, insurance, whatever would be necessary if anyone asked the right kind of question. People asked the right kind of question for a while, and then stopped. The motel sold a few more room nights. A couple of long-haul drivers came through who said they had to be in town for work. The rooms stayed sealed for 3 days. Luis put a temporary maintenance tag on the doorknob and taped a paper sign to the window. Curiosity is a flame. We like to say curiosity killed the cat, as if it absolves us of the impulse. There is no absolution. There was a moment a month later when I found myself alone in the security office, the shoebox containing the doll behind me on the shelf, the monitor giving off a cold glow. I cued the tape to 02:13:07 and watched the guest undo the last hour of his life. I watched in the way people watch a mirror, because it is easier to watch an image than to let the image watch you back. There are other oddities you notice when you keep a thing meant to be witnessed. My sleep began to puncture with dream hums, the sound of wet cloth being rubbed, a rhythm like hands timekeeping. I started to leave the office light on and found myself checking the hallway for shapes that were not there. If a car passed, I would wait in the moment until it was gone, as if the world had to close itself gently so something wouldn't slip in. People began to talk about the motel differently. Longtime guests ask for double rooms now, as if extra distance was an insurance against whatever the cameras had seen. And the doll. We thought the doll's disappearances were practical jokes, until one morning Anita found the shoebox open and the doll sitting, impossibly neat, on top of the filing cabinet in the office. No fingerprints on the box, no climb marks on the metal. The doll faced me like a tiny witness with no voice. I put it back. I wrapped it in plastic. I put the box in the trunk of my car and drove it out to the back of the property and buried it under a young maple, the roots only an inch from the surface. I thought burying was an ending, a neat snap of the hand. The next morning when I unearthed it, because I couldn't help myself, the doll was clean and dry, as if it had never been buried, and had been bought from a shelf that afternoon. The roots of the maple were undisturbed. There was a smear of damp on the trunk, like a palm. You learn odd things when you keep secrets. You learn the color of a sound. The doll's return had an odor now, a sweetness and metallic tang that made my throat close. At 3:12 a.m., I caught myself humming the same tune the vending machine used to blare. The staff started to leave early. Luis told Anita she should find work in the day shift at a laundromat in town. Tomas called in sick with a voice gone thin and stayed home for 3 days. The oddities scaled. They arrived like a slow tide. A guest reported that the coffee in the breakfast carafe tasted like cold soil the morning after the doll's reappearance. A family who checked in for one night claimed they woke to find the little stuffed toy on their son's bed, though the family swore they had never left anything in the room but their own luggage. People laugh when a thing comes up in conversation because laughter keeps us from naming fear. Stories get better with retelling, Hank would say over a cigarette, but I had started to think stories don't so much improve as they mutate to suit the listener. It got to the point where the world felt brittle. Even the mundane responsibilities gathered static. The motel's heating system broke down in early December, and pipes sang in a way that sounded like distant coughing. The local paper ran a small piece about an unexplained disturbance at the Pine Ridge. An old photograph of the motel from 30 years prior sat beside a story about how the town had once had a singular, expanded motel business in the 90s. People commented under the article, to each other, in lines of text that read like campfire logs. Have you seen the cameras? No. I tried to watch. I couldn't sleep after. The reporting was kind of like a mirror, flat and informative and dishonest about how it rearranged fear into digestible shapes. By December's second week, I had taken to making copies of the most important segments of tape and hiding them in different places. One went into the trunk of my car, another into the back of a drawer at the motel. One I kept on a flash drive and hid inside a hollowed-out book I used as a paperweight. The impulses that make you catalog a thing are sometimes the same impulses that keep you from leaving. I kept the footage because it was proof, and proof felt like protection. That feeling was a miscalculation. Some nights you feel like the world wants to be watched. Other nights you feel like you are the thing being observed. The tape started to show small, impossible returns that couldn't be explained away by camera angles or light. Camera 1, mounted on the lamp across the lot, caught a woman in black once, at 02:28:59 on a rain-silver Tuesday, walking along the motel's boundary as if she had a schedule laid out in the stars. She moved with the slow deliberation of someone reading a list. Her dress was dark in a way that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Her face was blocked by the hood or a veil. Her arms hung folded like a promise. When the lot camera's light swung over her, she vanished into a patch of shadow. No car passed, no human figure unrolled from that black. Hank swore he saw her silhouette reflected in his rearview mirror when he left at dawn. By the time New Year's rolled into town, cold, sharp, and indifferent, I had stopped suggesting explanations I didn't truly believe. The motel's regulars kept their distance, and the staff counted more than housekeeping and towels. The room that had held the guest was now an absence. Lewis kept it unbooked and kept his hand on the key as if its weight mattered. We stuck a handwritten sign on the door, unavailable. Nobody suggested an exorcist or a professor. Nobody at the desk wanted to be the kind of person who made the next decision. I began to keep hours I thought would buy me courage. Late one night, my curiosity turned into a procedure. I cued the tapes from the week the doll first appeared and made coffee I did not touch. I watched the feeds until the light in the parking lot flattened the horizon to a band of cold. The footage has a way of intensifying details when you stare at them that long. I began to take notes, the time code, the smell I imagine when I recall the frame, the angle of the lamp at the far end of the corridor. Around 2:10 a.m., the cameras conspired to show two things at once: the guest asleep on the bed in room 7, and, in the corridor, a smear that bled like wet paint from the left edge of the frame. In the top corner, the infrared gave the figure an odd purple fringe, a distortion that ought not to belong to human utility. He woke. He moved. The corridor figure did not need to move to make its presence felt. The air did that work alone. It is easy to say that I watched the tape because I had to know. It is the honest answer and the evasive one. What I do know is that every frame is a bargain. In exchange for vision, you give up some part of the ordinary cadence of life. You can't unknow what a camera gives up to you. There is no small undoing. The tape gave me his last minutes, but it also gave me a taste that wouldn't leave. At 02:13:07, the image held him a breath too long, his outline a small island in the static ocean. I found myself leaning toward the screen, feeling like an interloper at the wrong side of a funeral. I was still leaning when the monitor hiccuped and the image fractured into an array of red and blue speckles. The screen went dark for a beat that felt like an hour. And then, like the careful snap of a book closing, the feed returned. But something in the corner of the frame was different. It was a small thing at first, a shimmer, a detail that didn't belong. It wasn't recognition so much as contact. It felt as though the camera had been addressed and, in answering, had learned a new angle to hold. I turned the monitor off after that. The back office hummed with the motel's heartbeats, the refrigerator kicking on, the heater throat-clearing. The doll's shoebox sat on the shelf like a promise unkept. My hands were cold from holding the coffee thermos too long, and I put it back on the counter as if it were a relic. Outside, the highway took trucks and ghosts in equal measure. Inside, the light stayed too bright for anyone who wanted sleep. I realized then there was a cost attached to the tapes longer than the price of a night. Watching them was not neutral. The image keeps you awake the way a bone keeps a beast awake, because something in you recognizes that watching is a form of feeding. There are people who would look at that and call it bravado. Maybe that's true, or maybe it's simpler. I am human, and humans keep watch because some thread inside them says, if I look, maybe I'll understand, and understanding is the closest thing to safety we get. I watched because the motel became a place where things sat just out of explanation, and watching was the only thing that felt like action. On the morning after I watched that loop, I wrote the times down in a little notebook I kept for receipts and returned calls. The entries look orderly: dates, times, small notations. My handwriting turns a little shaky when I write about things I don't understand. I circle the time 02:13:07 in the margin. I put a star beside 02:13:43. I cross out the word explain. Beneath it, in the cramped margin, I wrote, "Do not show Luis." That night, unable to move the ache from my chest, I made one more copy of the tape, this one labeled with the date and nothing else, and hid it in the brisket of an old radio in the motel office. I told myself it was for safekeeping. I told myself I'd watch it once more and then put it away. At 2 a.m., the monitor flickered to life, and the time code slid like an unmoored ship across the frame. I cued the tape to the beginning of the sequence and sat down. I had told Thomas earlier that week that if anything happened, I would call the police. I had not. The motel's backroom clock ticked soft and indifferent. The world outside might have been carrying on with the large business of not noticing. I pressed play. The video started with the quiet of the bed, the lamp breathing in little sweeps of light. The corridor glowed, an artery of sodium. The doll lay as though waiting for someone to open a letter. At 02:13:07, he was there, alive, in the sense that breathing counts as living, and the rest of the motel held its breath with him. I don't remember which second it happened that made me drop the thermos. The cup didn't shatter, no aerodynamic miracle occurred. It was the way the image fractioned. The feed knifed into grain, and everything went very small, like looking through a screen of pins. In the pinhole, a shadow leaned and smiled, and the guest turned as if to answer. In those frames, the world simplifies things, saves them into icons. The icon was a face I didn't recognize, and yet felt as if I should know. It smiled like a familiarity you resent. The image clicked, and the corridor light went out, leaving a blackness that didn't belong to any ordinary night. When the feed returned, the bed was empty. I haven't described what came after, because the details matter. Some of them are for what will come next. I have given you what I can now. The smell of rain and something older, the small rag doll with its indifferent stitches, the corridor smear that isn't human and doesn't need to be, and the fact that a screen can show you a thing and leave you with the knowledge that you will never be the same. I kept the tape even when people told me to hand it over. I kept it even when the motel started to feel less like a place of work and more like a place where a line had been crossed. There is a part of me that hopes, stupidly, that someone reading this will tell me an ordinary human answer, that a man slipped away, that we misread a tired face, that the doll had been owned by a child's traveling companion. I know how stories end, with paperwork and people wanting to move on. But there is a thing in the back of my throat that tells me the cameras recorded his final minutes for a reason. They were witnesses, and witnesses are inconvenient. They keep a ledger in cold light. When I finally stood from the security office and walked down the corridor toward room 7 with Luis and the police 2 days after the feed cut to black, the hallway felt narrower, like someone's gaze had rearranged the space. The door creaked on its hinges the way all motel doors do, and then it sounded like it had remembered how to want. The room was empty. The bed made as if the guest had left a long time ago. The doll was nowhere to be seen. The window over the dresser was fogged, and there was an imprint on the pillow that might have been the shape of a head or might have been a paint left by the night. Sometimes the world gives you ambiguity as a consolation. We put the unavailable sign back on the door, and the motel resumed the business of rooms. People still came in and out with their luggage and their cigarette butts and their long, silent questions. But the cameras had opened something. Watching the footage had bound me to the motel in ways I didn't want. I found that my hand shook at odd moments, and my dreams were full of the smear moving along the corridor like a promise. I kept all of that to myself until the morning a colleague from the sheriff's office came by to ask for copies. He didn't say why in full. Officers often come with a kind of economy of language when there is something they do not want to burden you with. He asked to see the He asked to see the tapes like a man asking for directions, quiet, almost apologetic, then put his hand on the counter and leaned close as if the grain of the desk might tell him the motel secrets. He wore a uniform that smelled faintly of rain and coffee, and his badge number was the only thing he read to me straight. He held a thin folder and said, "We'd like copies," like it was a request we could refuse. I gave him a thumb drive I had labeled with the date in my cramped handwriting. I had 3 copies then, one in the drawer, one in my old radio, and the one I handed over. He examined the drive with the same slow courtesy a man uses before bad news. "We'll log it," he said. "Routine check. Nothing to worry about." That was a kindness of its own kind, the small human machinery that settles a slippery thing into a bureaucracy and thereby dulls its edges. He didn't pry, he didn't ask about the doll, he didn't ask about the smell in the hallways. He took the copy and left. He promised someone would call. No one called that week. A month later, the same man, now with a detective from the county, came back with a different posture, less of a neighborly favor, more of a request that had teeth. "We're investigating a missing persons," the detective said. She was younger than I'd expected and moved like she stitched silence into sentences. She wanted to see the original files. She explained time zone stamps and metadata with the kind of language that wraps an ugly thing in neat cloth. I handed over another copy because it felt like the honest thing to do. I told myself the tape would help them find an answer, and that would be the end of it. In the middle of watching the footage together in the storage room, the detective paused and rewound the corridor feed until the smear folded back on itself like a crease. She pointed at the top left corner where the pixel hummed. "What is that?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "We thought it was—" I stopped because the answer felt like superstition, and superstition was not evidence. They took the drives, wrote their reports. The detective was practical in the way of people whose job is to make ghosts seem like paperwork. She asked about check-in logs, about who had been in room 7 the week before, about missing persons reports in surrounding counties. Her questions made the motel feel like an artifact being cataloged. She left with a promise that they would follow up and with instructions about chain of custody and evidence tagging, terms that feel calming because they are precise and slow. 2 weeks later, someone on a town forum posted a clip from a file that matched our date. The video's edges were cropped and the audio muffled. It had been uploaded with a username that matched a burner account. The clip circulated fast in the small gravity of towns like ours. 100 shares, then 1,000, then a ragged pile of speculation. People who had never stood under the motel's sodium lights had opinions about what they thought they saw. The comments split neatly into what the internet always becomes: those who wanted an explanation and those who wanted the thing to be scarier than it was. The motel's phone rang more. Strangers asked about room 7 as if they might rent it for company. A couple drove through at dawn, held hands, and took a photograph of the facade under the neon sign. Luis answered the phone with less of the usual patience. He muttered about the property market and the trouble of running an old place when new chains plunked up off the interstate. The paperwork that helps people forget fear, insurance, maintenance requests, the pest company, started to fill drawers. The unavailable tag remained on the doorknob like an insistence. Then a kid from the news station called. He wanted a story about unexplained phenomenon. I told him the motel had lost a guest and that the police were handling it. Then I said nothing about the doll or the way the carpet leaned toward the inside of the hall as if the floor itself were listening. The producer insisted. She spoke in ways that made my job sound picturesque. I said, politely, that the motel would not be giving interviews. People respect what refuses a camera, and for a while that refusal stood like a border. But nobody can hold back a tide forever. After the clip slipped out, people began to show up who were not truckers and not motel regulars. There were kids with cheap tripods and men with souped-up cameras who wanted atmospheric footage. There were 2 young women who said they ran a podcast about small-town mysteries. Lewis let them in, as long as they signed a waiver that smelled of legal bluster. When they left, they carried with them the thrill of having been near a secret. They left the motel smelling like peppermints and conspiracy. The motel's life rearranged itself again, and the cost was small things. A late-night party kicked out after bottles clinked, a nervous woman asking for an extra blanket at dawn, a trucker's soliloquy about the woman in black. The corridor kept its hush. The cameras kept doing their job, recording hours of people looking at their phones, lovers arguing softly, nothing to mark the change. Then, like a bruise that surfaces after an impact, the footage would reveal a smear, a dark fold, a pixel that didn't obey the light. A week after the drives had left town, something else happened that showed the way threads pull. One morning, I came in and found a note tucked under the shoebox where I'd first put the doll. The handwriting was not Lewis's. It was smaller, hurried. "We found this on your porch. File attached." Someone had returned the doll. I lifted it out, and the fabric was damp in places that should have been dry. Its stitches were cleaner than they had any right to be. There was a scrap of paper folded beneath it, a poem fragment the size of a matchbook. "Stay where the leaf closes." It meant nothing and everything at once. I started to worry more about small things. The way the light flickered at odd intervals. That the shower curtain in room 7 sometimes hung as if someone had just stepped out. The way the ashtray by the vending machine could be full in the morning though no one had smoked during the night. Tomas gave notice and said he felt watched. Anita moved to day shifts at the laundromat, her pockets full of change and the quiet taciturn of someone trying to stitch herself back. Lewis said nothing. He stood and salted the driveway and watched the highway with the unfriendly patience of men who have been waiting to see if luck will move on. I kept watching the tapes. When you keep something dangerous in sight, it both comforts and consumes. I learned how to read the small tells. A corner of the corridor lamp that dimmed too soon. The way the camera's infrared sometimes painted a faint purple fringe around certain shapes. The sound's tendency to thin in the moments before a frame broke. I copied files and hid them in places that, in the end, weren't secure. A gum tin, a hollowed-out book. Secrets are never as secret as you think. Then, slowly, as if someone were testing the temperature of the water, the motel began to have visitors who searched rooms with the wrong expression. They tested the mattress springs, they lingered in corners. Once, a woman in a plain coat came to the desk at 1:12 a.m. and asked for a key for room 7. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has rehearsed a request to make it sound ordinary. I told her the room was unavailable. Her face showed no surprise. She asked for a cigarette and then left without ever lighting it. Later, the camera showed the woman in black moving along the boundary of the lot, as if walking a known beat. By then, the town had a collection of versions of the same story. Some said the guest had been part of a family who didn't talk. Others said he had come from a long drive and a sudden decision to stop. The paper printed a short correction to the initial article. The Internet's appetite dwindled for a moment and then refocused on something else. People forget the shape of the things that give them no immediate danger. Fear likes a rhythm. It builds, and then it finds new anchors. I began to notice my body changing. Sleep became a thin curtain I kept closed against drafts. My appetite changed. The small motilities of a night worker, reaching for the phone, slipping a key into a slot, the way fingers find familiar scuffs on a counter, became the only gestures I trusted. I stopped answering the motel's phone between midnight and 4 in the morning unless I knew the voice on the other end. I stopped leaving the office light off. The doll, folded into plastic in my trunk, hummed at the edges of my mind as if something living breathed under the fabric. The investigator came back twice. Each time she watched the clips with the same clinical eye and the same private exhale. She asked about property owners in other states, about the guest's ID, about whether we'd seen similar items before. She was careful to avoid the edges of things that weren't evidence. I do not blame her for being skeptical. Skepticism is the tool that keeps friendly professions whole. But the doubt she carried could not undo whatever image had sat in the back of my skull since I'd first watched that loop of corridor light and smeared shadow. There is a moment when you realize that keeping a record of something does not mean you can contain its appetite. The footage had become, for me, a ledger of small violences. The way the doll returned, the ways the cameras flickered at the same hour, the way the hall smelled like damp earth on certain mornings without any rain in the town. The motel's business tightened, as if something had budgeted out the nights into fewer occupants. A traveling salesman who'd been staying across from room 7 told us in a voice of embarrassed relief that he had dreamed the corridor like a mouth and that he had woken with the taste of metal. In midwinter, the motel's pipes burst in a way that flooded a good part of the eastern wing. Repairs took 2 weeks. The town's contractors did their work, their boots and language moving like practical prayers. They patched the leaks, replaced tiles, and stuck plastic over damp patches. We closed rooms, moved mattresses, and put a sign in the window that said, "Under repair." Repairs have an ordinary efficacy to them. They take something that's wrong and, if done well enough, make it simply a problem to solve. After the repairs, we reopened the rooms, but the air felt thinner. People were polite but careful. They made small talk about the road conditions and the price of diesel. I kept my copies of the tapes like a talisman. I told myself I was safeguarding evidence. I told myself I would hand them in if the right face asked. I had a dream once that winter where the corridor was longer than it had any right to be. Lamps stretched into an impossible distance, and at the very end a silhouette stood and uncurled like a promise. In dreams, logic gives way to the logic of feeling. You wake, and the memory of the body in sleep lingers like a bruise. I began to wake sweating with the same floating tune I had hummed in the mornings, the vending machine's half-broken melody, and at least twice I woke to a smell like wet cloth pressed into iron. On a Wednesday in late January, the detective called. Her voice had the edge of someone who had been reading cold records for too long. They had a lead, she said, a camera on a road outside a neighboring county. It had caught a silhouette walking the shoulder of the road at 3 in the morning on the night the guest had last left our lot. The image was fogged, grainy, and wrong in the way that makes men stare. The silhouette looked, from time to time, like a person, and from time to time like something that had been put into the air. They wanted our tape compared to the road camera to see continuity. She asked if I could bring the original files. I drove to the station with the files in my glove box, the shoebox with the doll wrapped in a towel in the back seat. The radio murmured nothing of importance. The station smelled like fluorescent soap and paperwork. The detective ran the footage side by side and watched the 2 frames as if trying to fold one into the other. There was a slice, less than a second, where the corridor smear in my footage seemed to mirror itself in the roadside camera, a dark fold folding like cloth. "It looks like a movement pattern," she said, "but there's no way to tell speed or scale for sure. Could be wind, could be animals, could be something else," I said, and the words came out like a confession. She didn't look at me like I had lied. She looked at me like she had been waiting to see who would call it. They took the files. They took them into a locked room and watched them with headphones and charts. For days I heard nothing. Then, on a thin afternoon, she called again. "We compared timestamps," she said. "Some things match. The pattern is consistent with movement along nearby grounds at the same hours. It doesn't prove anything about she hesitated, what that object is, but it does show vectors that suggest the shape isn't random. She didn't say supernatural. She didn't have to. She used language that kept the record honest without making promises. She thanked me for my cooperation and told me to take care. In the end, bureaucracy made of facts is a kind of quiet shelter. It does not warm you, but it gives you a ledger. Weeks turned into months. Small things kept happening. The doll, whenever it returned, seemed to have been mended. The stitches were tighter. The stuffing was less lumpy. Once, the doll's stitched mouth had been unpicked and re-sewn into a faint smile. I found it on the windowsill, looking out as if it were waiting for someone who had not come. The motel's guests complained less. People passed through like shadows with intentions. They paid, left, and focused on the next town. I tried to quit the job 3 times that year. The first time I handed Luis a letter that read like a resignation. Practical, honest, the sort of thing you sign when you want to be glittered away from what binds you. He read it, folded it, and put it under his hand. "You don't have to go," he said. His voice was not pleading, it was a fossilized kindness. He reminded me of the reasons people keep working at places that will not pay them more than their hands can take. The rhythm, the known dangers, the way nights anchor you. I left the letter unsigned in the drawer and bounced it back and forth in my pocket like a coin. Then, in March, the last real thing happened that changed the calculus. It was a low wind night, one of those evenings that makes a man keep his coat on inside. I was alone in the office with the monitor because Luis had gone to sleep early and Tomas had moved to a different job. The town had been quiet for a week. I'd started to think all the noise had been the work of rumor and tiredness. I cued the older copy of the tape to 02-1307 to watch the clip again, not because I wanted to, but because my attention had the flavor of an addiction. The feed began, grainy and faithful. He lay on the bed, the doll perched like a punctuation. At 02-1312, the corridor smear crept in from the left edge like an unwanted memory. The pixel in the top left corner pulsed like a distant heart. He sat up. He stood. He opened the door and walked into the hall. The smear leaned. The lamp at the end of the corridor flickered in a way that looked like breath. Then, at 02-1331, something happened that made my lungs forget how to work. The corridor camera caught, for a fraction of a second, not the guest, but me. I remember pressing my palms to the counter as if to steady a wave. My outline was there in the frame. The way I stand with my shoulders tight, the way my head cants when I listen for distant engines. I hadn't left the office. I had not been in that corridor. The camera did not mistake angles. It recorded what I looked like when I glanced down the hall when a sound makes my teeth ache. In the footage, my figure stood at the end of the corridor for exactly 2 frames. It tilted toward the door of room 7 and then folded back. My hair, a poor, practical cut that I do not think of as memorable, was visible. The way my coat sat over one shoulder was visible. I knew that frame as I knew the scratches on the counter, but it had not been me that night. I had been sitting in the office, my hands around a thermos that had long since gone cold. I sat in the control room with the tape frozen on that frame and felt the room close like a fist. I hit rewind, then play, then rewind again. The pixels refused to rearrange themselves into a version that made logical sense. The detective had the files. I had given her a copy. The police had the timestamps. None of that made the image less ominous. Later, I found my handwriting on a yellow receipt pad in the back office where I'd written a time down, 02-1331. The notation was a small act of order in the face of an upheaval. I did not write why I had noted it. The thing that made me retake my breath was not that I saw my face on the tape. It was that on the screen, my figure, my impossible figure in the corridor, turned toward the camera and mouthed something like a greeting. It was not a normal human mouth, too slow, as if someone had slowed film down until the cartilages looked like petals. But the tiny movement was a communication of recognition. There are things in life that you can fold into routine, taking out the trash, counting the register, sweeping the hall. There are other things that rearrange you. Seeing myself in the footage, my face that should have been sleep-washed and ordinary was one of those things. It made me understand that watching had a cost I had not fully negotiated. The camera had recorded him, and then, somehow, it had recorded me in a moment I had never lived. It felt like an account being settled, sight for sight. I tried to make a rational accounting. Maybe the frame had been an overlay, an editing artifact introduced by file corruption. Maybe a copy of the tape had been tampered with, some prank playing with my head. I called the detective and we compared backups. Her voice on the phone was careful. She had my original drive and the tapes, and her technicians would look at the files with software that could detect splices. She promised to let me know. They found no obvious manipulations. The metadata on the files was clean. The glitches belonged to the cheap cameras, stutter, dropout, infrared banding, but none of that was a stamp that explained a figure that looked like me. The technicians could not say how my image had been recorded walking through a corridor I had not left. They used the language of caution. Can't rule out, can't rule in. That answer is precise and empty in equal measure. After that, things accelerated in a way a storm accelerates when the first wind hits the ocean. The doll became a regular occurrence again, more frequent and cleaner-minded. Always returned to places I had been in, sometimes to the office, sometimes to the glove compartment of my car. Once it was on my pillow when I left for a night to stay at a friend's house. When I came back the next morning, the doll was on the filing cabinet, looking like it had been waiting. The radio in the office, the one with the hollow cavity, started to breathe static in a rhythm that matched the vending machine's broken melody. My phone would ring at 2:13 exactly and then click dead. I stopped answering at that hour. My complaints to the detective softened into requests. "Do you have any advice?" I asked once. "Keep your distance," she said. "Document everything. If more cases turn up, we'll coordinate." "Keep my distance?" I asked. "From what?" She hesitated. "From whatever it is that's connected to that room," she said finally. "People get curious, and then they get involved. There are patterns with these things. Sometimes a place collects attention, and the attention becomes part of the problem." Attention becomes part of the problem. That phrasing lodged like a splinter behind my ribs. Watching had not been the solution. It had been the first motion of feeding. The less I looked, the less I felt seen. And yet the cameras, those dumb mechanical eyes, kept their records. The more I tried to avoid the corridor, the more the sense of being addressed settled in me like sediment. Then, on a night when the motel felt like a held breath, Camera 3, the corridor camera, captured around 02:13:07 a movement that made the hair on my arms stand up along their roots. It was me in the frame again, clearly, unmistakably, walking toward room 7. But this time the camera also captured the smear at my shoulder. The smear leaned into my outline like a second shadow. And for a moment the two moved together as if one body wearing two kinds of dark. I watched that frame until the light in the monitor bled into a thin haze. My reflection in the glass looked like a man who had slept too little. The thing at my shoulder, if you called it that, placed a hand on a door that I had never touched that night. The smear's touch had the look of someone practicing the economy of a thief. Minimal, precise, a claim that was more an aiming than a taking. I tried to explain away the image by working through the propensities of equipment and error. I called the hardware company. I spoke with techs who explained infrared artifacts and multiplexing errors. There are plausible explanations for many things. But at some point, when explanations have been exhausted and the things themselves persist, you have to accept the possibility that your life has moved into a topology you didn't consent to. The motel's margins had become a place you and the other shape could both inhabit in different ways. Luis put the motel up for sale that spring. He said words about retirement and the cost of repairs and other places to be. He spoke like a man trying to make a practical map out of something that had become moral. The motel sign flickered on and off as if it were blinking, saying goodbye in half-lights. People came to look. An investor from the city talked about turning the place into a boutique stopover. A broker asked about occupancy rates. None of that mattered to me as much as the hours at which the corridor light behaved like a living thing. I pitched becoming the night manager elsewhere and then canceled the meeting. In the end, the motel sold to a couple who claimed they were renovators. They walked the property with clipboards and pleasant cliches. They signed the papers, handed Luis a small check, and drove off with the keys. The rooms were cleaned and repainted, the carpets replaced, the doll disappeared for a while as if embarrassed by all the fuss. People said that when money moves through a place, memory follows for cover. I cleaned out my desk and packed up my thermos, the old cassette player, the small stapler I had used for years, and a shoebox that held a doll that stubbornly refused to stay buried. After the sale, the new owners started to do serious work, tearing out the hallway paneling, rewiring, upgrading cameras to high definition that did not paint the world purple. They did not believe in the stories. They believed in tourism and tasteful chrome. They replaced camera 3 with a model that boasted such fidelity that you could read the emboss on a coin. They told us all this during an orientation with coffee and smiling efficiency. They promised to put the past behind. They changed the signs. And then, one night, because things do not respect advertising campaigns, the new system recorded a loop at 02:13:07 that made my stomach go cold. In the high-definition footage, the smear was more defined, less of a smear and more of a shadow with an edge. It leaned against room 7's door like it had been waiting in a queue. The guest walked through the threshold and paused, and, for the first time in any footage, the camera captured the thing in the top left corner, a tiny, luminous pixel that was not an ember, but rather a focus, an eye. It blinked. Still, the motel followed me in the way a weather system follows the sea, quietly, inexorably. I would wake at 2:13 a.m. and taste metal. My phone would ring and the call would fail. Once, in a supermarket parking lot, I saw a figure that had the same gait as the woman in black move behind a tree. I turned, heart doing the small, ridiculous staccato that betrays you when you are afraid. There was nothing but a shape of shadows and a drunk driver singing along to the radio. The copy I had kept in the hollow of the radio was the one I could not bring myself to watch. There is a kind of cowardice that passes for wisdom when you refuse to play something knowing its end. I told myself I had watched enough. I told myself that watching had cost me privacy and a kind of mental peace. But curiosity sits like an itch. One winter night, 3 years after the guest had died, and after the motel had become something else on a map, I found the radio's lid and took the tape out and the drive and cued the file. The footage began in a way I had seen too many times. Lamp, bed, a man asleep. The frame's time code read 02:13:07. The feed looked like every other feed. For a long part of the loop, nothing happened. Then, as if someone in the world were folding time and laying the guest's last moments down again like a slow film strip, the corridor smear moved, and the guest stood, and the door opened. I watched until the part I had seen before, the part where the guest walked out of the room. Then the camera held something at the edge of the frame, and the pixel in the corner blinked like a small, concentrated eye. For the first time in any footage I played, the smear reached out to touch the shape of a man, and the man, my man, the image that had carved itself into me, turned and looked directly into the lens with a face I recognized as mine and not mine. In the very frame, something like a pressure came through the speakers, and the room's light flickered. When the image returned from its break, the guest was gone. The corridor held the outline of the smear, and in the smear, if smear is what you call it, there was a small impression of a face, like a palm print on the darkness. For one slow frame second, the camera's eye and that face were held in the same register of being seen, and it felt as if something had been exchanged. After that, the footage corrupted and looped and became nonsense. The file refused to render the last few seconds cleanly. I tried to play it on different machines. A friend, once reluctant to dabble in superstition, told me she had tried to open the file and her lights at home had gone out in the middle of the night. I cannot offer you a technical explanation for how a video might make a house go dim. I can only tell you what the image does to a person who has watched it too long. It invents places in your life for fear to sit. There are days when the world acts with the benign negligence of being normal. Then, without fanfare, the world shows you that it kept a ledger all along. The Motel's cameras had recorded a man's final minutes. They recorded him, and they recorded the intensity of him being seen. They recorded, in cold light, the means by which that seeing altered the watcher. I watched the footage until the line between me and the thing in the margin blurred into a small arithmetic that made no sense. The camera saw him last, and in watching him, I let the camera learn my face. If there is a lesson in this, it is small and unglamorous. You can watch and catalog and archive, and sometimes that will be wisdom. Sometimes watching is necessary. But watching asks for a price, and sometimes you pay it without the dignity of knowing the coin you spent. I have told this because the Motel's records meant that someone else might avoid the small mistakes I made. The late-night bravado, the misplaced conviction that seeing was a defense. It is a poor defense, and it is all we have. I keep one copy of the footage hidden. I do not watch it anymore. I drove past the Motel once, months after I moved away, and the new sign gleamed like a promise worked with paint. The lot was empty, and the world looked as if someone had remade it. But the camera, wherever it lies now, records hours and arranges them into vectors and patterns. It keeps a register. It knows the times when the world is more generous with its shadows. I once heard a man say that cameras do not lie. I have learned our language is not so absolute. Cameras show you frames. They do not speak of meaning. But frames accumulate into habits. A camera can learn to recognize the shapes people make by watching them long enough. When it is done, you are no longer certain who is watching whom. If you have ever worked nights, you know how the hours can change you. How a man learns to keep soft watch on other people's lives and ends up trading pieces of his own for that knowledge. The security cameras recorded his final minutes. I watched them, frame by frame, until what hid in the margins of the feed leaned into the shape of me and learned my face. If this story lands on you like a weight, and you have ever seen something that cannot be told without pressing it into the light, tell someone you trust. If you've had an encounter like this, with lines that don't add up in the morning or an image that doesn't belong, leave it in the comments. Talk to someone. Be kind to each other. And if you find yourself watching the camera that's caught more than it should, remember, seeing sometimes comes with a price. If this stirred something in you, share it with someone who listens to late-night stories. And if you want more found footage accounts, there's another video on the channel that goes deeper into how night shifts teach you to read silence.